Today, I want to talk about what's known as the qualifying exam. And it's something, let's say, that I think maybe doesn't get talked about enough, at least for incoming grad students. Usually you hear about what, you get well informed as far as what's going to happen that first month in grad school, and everybody realizes you have some kind of PhD thesis defense and that there's things that happen in between. The most important of these would be the PhD qualifying exam. And yet, I think it should be given more credit, or it's important that students realize what they're up against and what's involved, because sometimes there's sort of like a mystery about it, and there's a couple different formats it can take. And so I just, in today's video, I just want to kind of go over it quickly as far as what to expect. And so usually, well, in my case, when I was pursuing a PhD, I took my exam during my fifth semester, so halfway through my graduate school experience. I know some schools will do it as early as the third semester or fourth. Some places might allow you to push it back a semester if your research isn't progressing, but typically I would say it's in the fourth or fifth semester where students encounter this. And at least the version that I had to take in grad school. And for me, what I had to do was in my fifth semester, I had to organize a meeting with my thesis committee in order to give an oral presentation. And in this presentation, I had to speak for about 40 minutes. And the first half of that was spending time to talk about the background of my research and my research progress to date. So basically, I had done a little more than a year's worth of research, and I needed to show some data. I needed to explain like the motivation for my research. I had to discuss challenges I faced or just like accomplishments, and basically say like I've been working and this is what I've gotten done so far. And in the second half of the talk, I had to propose what I wanted to do for the remainder of grad school. So in this case, I would talk about these are continued experiments I want to do. And what the timeline for those experiments are. Now, in my case, and I think in the case of most of these exams, this is a closed door meeting with just the student and the thesis committee. And it can be adversarial. And by adversarial, what I mean is I've heard stories where students, they're less than 5 minutes in and they're already being asked questions. And instead of giving a 40-minute presentation, it might take them 2 hours to get through all of their slides, or maybe they don't even get through their slides if it's that bad or if they're unprepared. And so in my case, I pretty much breezed through my slides. I had a few questions along the way, but my committee mostly reserved their questions till I was completed. And then they went around the table and each one of them had their 3 to 5 questions, wanting me to explain something in more detail, or wanted to confirm that I felt I could accomplish my work in the timeline I had set out, or what my biggest obstacles were. Asked me about other people doing similar work and if I thought I could get it published. So they would ask, like trying to dig a little deeper on what I talked about in the presentation. And one faculty member not on my committee had warned me by saying, don't talk about anything that you don't want to talk about. So, and by that, what he meant is don't give your committee some fodder to come after you with. So, if there's something that's very minor or isn't important in your talk, don't mention it. Because if you mention it, and some member of your committee decides they want to ask you a question about it, they're assuming you are an expert on it. And so only, kind of limit yourself or focus on what the important details are, so that way you don't end up going down some tangent that's maybe irrelevant. And then it makes you look bad and makes it look like you're not prepared to move on with your PhD. And that's the whole point of the qualifying exam, is to show that you've been making progress and that you are ready to move forward in the program. You've made sufficient progress that it's worth keeping you around to finish your PhD. And so, you give this presentation, and like I said, it's adversarial, which means you can be stopped at any time and ask questions. And you need to be prepared to understand or explain your research to experts who are sitting around the table. So that's the process I went through. And the result of this meeting or presentation can lead to one of several outcomes. One, and this is ideal, is you get done with your presentation, the questions, and they ask you to leave the room for a few minutes. Then they ask you to come back in the room and they tell you you've passed. They shake your hand. They tell you to sign a piece of paper and you can move on with your life. That's sort of the ideal situation. I don't know what the percentages are as far as how many people pass. But that's ideally what you want, because if you pass the exam, you can breathe a sigh of relief, and now you can focus on the second half of your PhD research and focus on, accomplishing the goals you just explained in your presentation, and, starting to think about the finish line, which is, getting your thesis completed. And, this exam is sort of like at the middle of the graduate student, the PhD experience. And, there's a lot of pressure because not everybody passes. And if you do pass, it doesn't mean you're living on easy street. It means you need to accomplish things in order to get your thesis and to get it in a reasonable time. There are people who they get past this experience and then they start living life, on easy street and not coming into the lab. And the next thing you know, like, instead of getting out in 5 years, it's coming close to 7 years and they haven't gotten any work done or any papers published. That looks bad. And so passing this exam doesn't mean I'm going to get my PhD. Just like reaching the summit of Mount Everest doesn't mean I'm getting off the mountain alive. There's still work to be done. There's still a path forward, and you can't just take it easy now and coast. You need to work as hard as you have ever worked. It's just you've been basically given permission, or you've been basically told that you're succeeding and you need to keep working hard to get your PhD. So the happy outcome is to pass. But there's at least a couple other options. One would be to fail. And typically, if you fail, there's signs ahead of time that you're in trouble. And if you suspect that there's signs or you're worried about it, you should really be having a conversation with your supervisor or perhaps with some other faculty to try and figure out, what do I need to do because I'm concerned. And, if you're not doing well in classes, if your projects just aren't working out for you, maybe there's other things going on that just suggest that you're not making sufficient progress. And, and if you suspect that I can't be ready on time for my presentation, there's always the possibility that you can ask for some kind of an extension. But usually those might be, if you can make a convincing argument, maybe they'll let you push it back one semester, but they're not going to let you push it back a year or two or indefinitely, because the department wants you to get the PhD. They don't want you to be around for 10 years trying to work on it. So there's limitations as far as how far back you can push this exam. So failure is sort of like the worst case scenario. And again, like, I don't know the statistics on that, but I have known of students who go into the exam and for one reason or another, it ends poorly and they're asked to leave the program. Um, the third option would be what's known as a conditional pass. And this is actually more common, I would say, than failing outright. And in this case, you give your presentation, but the committee has concerns. And so this may be perhaps you had trouble in a class and your GPA is too low. And so they basically give you a semester to get your grades in order. They're not going to give you 3 years for that. They're going to maybe give you one semester at most to fix your problem with your grades. Another option might be they didn't like your research proposal. Maybe you're doing good research, you're being productive in the lab, but your proposal and a timeline just doesn't make sense. They don't agree with your ideas. And so they want you to go back to the drawing board and then come back in a month or two and either give another presentation with an updated proposal, or maybe they just want you to put it in writing. And a lot of times, I should say, with the oral presentation, there is a written component where you might be expected to write a 2 to 10 page document to give to your committee in advance that is an overview of what you're going to talk about in the presentation. So that is common. And so sometimes when you have this conditional pass, you're asked to update that document. Maybe they look at your previous work and they say, like, why didn't you do this experiment? Why didn't you try this technique? And so they may ask you to go back and get more data and to prove that an experiment is possible or to confirm some results. And that's why it's always good to do every experiment more than once, because if you've repeated the experiment multiple times, you can say, this is where my data is leading me and it's very consistent or it's not consistent. And you can kind of have a conversation about what your data looks like. So basically with the conditional pass, it could be classes, it could be an issue with the data, it could be that there's an issue with your proposal. Now, if I would say that if there's issues with all of those, that's maybe when you're more likely to fail outright. But if you're given a conditional pass, you're also given a timeline as far as how much time you have to take care of those unresolved matters. Now, a potential other option is you may decide, or you may decide with your supervisor or with your committee, that it makes more sense for you to walk away with a master's degree instead of going on to the PhD. I've seen that happen. Sometimes when a student gets a conditional pass, they're given the choice, like, do you want to go on or do you want to walk away with a master's? If you fail the exam, depending on the reason why you failed, a master's degree may also be possible there. Maybe you've done a lot of great work and you've gotten some papers out, but there's other matters that are concerning. They may give you a way to walk away by doing a master's. So there's those are all, like, there's like 4 or 5 different ways that this process can end. And ideally, like, if you're really want the PhD and you're doing good work and you're a good student, really what you want to do is you want to make sure you pass this without any conditions, because if there's a conditional pass, it's going to set you back a few months from moving forward with your research. And in the grand scheme of things, that may not seem like a big deal, but depending on the timing, it could, cause some issues where instead of doing the experiments you have planned, now you got to do you got to do a bunch of other experiments instead. So really, this is the culmination of everything you've done to this point. And this is the moment where it's decided you have a chance to go on and get the PhD, or we're going to ask you to leave the program because you're not going to get the PhD. And so in a previous video, I talked about how grad school is like climbing Mount Everest, or maybe climbing any great mountain, where, this is the pinnacle, this is the top, this is the moment you are trying to get by. Because if you get by this, there's a chance, the end is in sight. um, but you can still screw it up after this moment. So but I think a lot of times it's overlooked as, like this isn't the big deal, but really this is a big moment in the experience. Now, I will say, like in my experience or from talking to other people, like the oral presentation is very common these days. That's typically how this qualifying process works. But I am aware that in some majors, they focus on a written exam or a coursework exam. And I know back in the day when I was a meteorology student, this was much more common there. I don't know which programs go this route these days or how many do. Again, I don't look up the statistics. But in some cases, you may be asked to participate in a written exam at the midpoint of your grad school experience. And this may be in addition to the oral presentation or may be in place of it. And so I would say when you're applying to grad schools or when you get to grad school, you want to investigate, like, what is the qualifying exam at this school? What will I be expected to do, and what's the timeline for it? Because if you're doing a written exam, usually that would be at the end of your second year or once you've wrapped up all of your coursework. And for the coursework exam, what you do is you're going to sit down and there's going to be a question from every class being taught by the department, and you're going to have to answer questions related to the coursework that you've taken. Now, for me, like you don't have to answer questions in other courses that you didn't take, but you're expected to answer so many questions and you're expected to have a certain score. And I will say that when I did my master's degree, I had to do a written comprehensive exam at the end of that. And so I will have another video where I talk a little bit more about this exam, because that was a bigger deal for my master's degree. And I also know that there were PhD programs in meteorology that had this exam. So again, like I said, like some majors, I think this may still be around, but I don't know how common it is. But just be aware that if you're in a program with a written exam, then this is also something you would have to prepare for. And at least at the time when I was studying meteorology, the way it worked was you were expected to get 70% on the exam in order to pass. And if you didn't pass, then there were either the option to retake the exam. Usually you'd be given one chance to retake the exam, or the thesis committee or the departmental faculty would come up with another option for you to address why you didn't pass the exam. So I hope that this video gives a little bit of insight as far as what this qualifying exam is. Again, I would say it's really important when choosing a school or when arriving on campus to inquire, because you need to know what the timeline is. Am I going to be running into this in my second or my third year of grad school? It's good to, talk to other students in your research group to find out their experiences. This is why it's so important also to pick the right people to be on your thesis committee, because if you're doing the oral presentation, they're the ones who are going to sit in that presentation and be firing questions at you and deciding about your future. If you're doing the written exam, pretty much all the faculty contribute to that, but it's still good to take the right classes, in which case then you're better prepared and more interested in the content and hopefully better qualified to answer the questions that are on the exam. And so I wish you luck, especially those who are coming up on this exam soon. I know it's a very stressful process, and I would say the sooner you start preparing for it, the better off you'll be. Usually, you want to prepare a few months in advance. You don't want to wait 2 weeks out and trying to be putting a presentation together or studying for the exam. but I would say the majority of students do pass. And it's just a matter of preparing yourself and knowing what you have to do to be prepared. And if you take grad school seriously from day one, you will be well prepared, or you will have a good understanding of what's needed to pass through this process, and then continue on with your PhD. So thanks for tuning in today. I look forward to chatting with you again real soon. Bye.